Hello. This video is first in a series just looking at the asset management functionality in Connect. This is an example walkthrough of a very simple compliance uh, scenario. So it's a single compliance item, and we're just going to try and explain the linkages that you put in place in Connect. So Connect has been designed with a very decoupled, highly flexible solution. And there are quite a few steps you can see from the diagram, but actually the process is quite straightforward. As soon as you get your head around it, it then allows you to really construct the process however you want to. So we've got a property here that we've just set up as a test property that's got a single asset on it. The asset is just a compliance item. So the asset here I've just called fire alarm test. I've got some basic information. I've got some information here that's going to get passed out to the mobile to provide some instructions. And then we've got a compliance panel down here. So this has got a compliant until date. So this is at the time of time recording this video, slightly out of compliance. And then I've got two options here. We can either create a cyclical program. So we could create a cyclical program, weekly fire alarm test. We could say we were going to do that weekly, every week, create the order a day before the start of the week, and then we could come along and say which order template to use, code template to use, and we could say use the fire alarm test. So this will be one way of doing this. The other way of doing this is to, on the asset detail itself in the compliance piece, basically tick this box here, and that just says when I get within 1 day of the compliant until date, create a new job. And the same process, it again then uses the code template. So as you would expect, I've got a compliant until date here, and I've got a dashboard widget that's looking at compliance items. And I've got a widget here which is looking at fire alarm tests. I've got one which is overdue. This is just an asset widget. And then when I drill down, that's that fire alarm. So I'm back to where I was 2 seconds ago with the same asset highlighted here on the dashboard. Okay, so when we raise a job, the next thing it does is goes to a code template. So the asset is built first. You have a rule that says at this frequency, create an order, and the order references a code template. So a code template is part of the diagnostic process. So it's underneath the diagnostic configuration. And I've got a fire alarm test. And the code template is really primarily just setting the contract trade. So it basically, this is the equivalent of the new order defaults that you're probably more familiar with, but this allows you to come in, add an SOR code or a job code, set things like categories, subcategories, work streams. But really it's allowing you to come along and set the contract trade. So if we go back to our document here, the objective of the code template is primarily to set the contract trade. So now we've got an order that's been basically set up. It's got its work stream, it's got its priority, and it's got a contract trade. The next place we go to is the contractor responsibilities here. So this is going to take the contract trade, add an area based on the property that the job is actually taking place at, and then essentially based on the combination of those two, it will assign a contract. So this is a contractor responsibilities. This is my fire alarm test. So this is basically saying if the top fields, so if the contract trade is this and the organization is this, i.e. the client, and the area the property is in is this, then this is the contract that we raise this job against. And then we can specify whether the work is done internally or externally. If we say that the job is done externally, then we would specify the supplier. And if the system comes through this path, it will automatically subcontract that work. There'll be a separate video to look at creating a compliance process out through a subcontractor. But essentially, you can make that completely hands-free. Okay, so we've now come down here, we've linked from the asset to the code template. The contractor responsibility has now picked up and said, okay, based on where the property is and what sort of work it is, this is how that work's going to get done. And then the next thing that happens is a process template rule evaluates the job. So this is under issues. So we've got these rule sets here. So, and essentially you can evaluate any combination of any of these fields here. So the system is basically saying where any of these are the case, and in my case here, because the code template is very specific, I'm not worrying about any of the other fields, but you can see that you can get very granular here. So I'm just saying if this is a fire alarm test as specified by the code template, then use the following process template. And process template, this is the final piece of the puzzle, nearly the final piece of the puzzle. And the process template is, here it is, fire alarm test. So the process template is, these are just process steps. So these are normal steps, start, say you've arrived. This one here, the inspection process, is a new type of process step. So this is a process step with an operation of view assets. So when you select this operation, you get some new options down here. So in this case, these asset linking rules. So what the system is doing here is saying, I want you to find any asset on this property that meets this category and subcategory and link those to the job. In this case, because it was spun up from the job, it would actually already be linked. And as you'll see in other videos, but this would allow I could spin a job up from a compliance item called fire safety check, but I could then link to the order all of the individual assets that were involved in a fire safety check. So that's how this works. And then this is referencing another process template. So I've basically got my basic framework of my process steps here, which is start, get there, and link these assets in. Actually, when I do this, I'm then going to have one step for each of the assets involved in the process. And in this case here, that is going to be dictated by another process template called compliance form. So that is just a straightforward process template. So here it's only got one step in it, and this is just a run survey. So, but what's going to happen here is that survey will be linked back through this chain directly to that asset. Obviously, this asset in this example is not a physical asset, it's just a compliance item on the property. So now I've got a form. So this is how we end up with the path. So this is how we end up, and then we end up with a view asset operation, and we end up with a run survey item that goes and runs a form. And so that's the final piece of the puzzle. If we come down here and we look for that compliance form, they end up with a form. There's a new form type here of asset, and I've got a compliance form down here. And this is the line, and the line is allowing me to check all this information in here. And there's a question in here which is confirm that the checks are all completed and that there were no issues. And on that line, I've got an action. So if we say that if we say yes to that question, which means we did complete the test and there were no issues, then it's going to run a survey line action that says update the compliant until date on that asset. And that is when we then loop back to where we started. So then we loop back to here with the asset. Oops, wrong one. We loop back to the fire alarm test. And the fire alarm test here, then the compliant until date is going to get recalculated. It's going to get recalculated by adding this value here, so the compliance interval. So I want you to add this many dates to, and then here you can choose whether or not. So in this case, I'm saying when you recalculate it, it would move to the 15th of October. You could do it from, you could move it, you could add the interval to the previous compliant date, or you could use the MOT type rule. And the MOT type rule basically says if you are within this threshold of the date, then you're allowed to add the interval to the previous date. But if you're too early, if you're outside of the threshold, then you have to add it to the date that you did the work. So you've got all those options. But the chain that you're going to go through is you're going to end up, you're going to raise a job, and then you're going to end up running a form. The form is going to have a direct link back to the asset. And when you complete the form, there's a survey line action that is then going to go and calculate the compliance date on the action. So just to quickly see that in action, so the system has raised a job. I've got a fire alarm test. These are the steps that we just saw on the definition. So we start travel, we arrive on site, and then we press the start inspection step. And in this case, the start inspection step is giving me access to that fire alarm test. And when I do that, I've got that form that we had, and the form comes along, it surfaces information from the asset, gives me the opportunity to update some information. So you may have noticed on the asset I had included the manufacturer and the model panel, because for a fire alarm you may want to keep a record of that. If you don't know it here, you can type that in and then we'll update the asset. And I can come along here, so I might come along here and say Chubb. That's not how you spell Chubb, is it? So I might come along here and say it's a Chubb fire alarm, and yes, it's okay. This field down here is just a read-only date stamp, and I'm going to use that field to stamp into this field that you can see in the background here. So it's going to update the last compliance check date. So this has just got a pushback on the form definition of that field. So I'm going to say yes. I could take a photo of the asset. Let's take a photo of my keyboard and pretend that's a fire alarm. And then we're going to finish that. So that is the process looped round and completed. And then I've got a step on here, which is just to say carry out the checks. Yes, and all this does is sets the visit result on the job. And then I'm going to leave site. So this is just normal process step mechanisms. So if we then come back to the asset, we can now see that the last compliance check date has been set to today. The manufacturer has been updated because we pushed that back, and the compliant until date has been recalculated by adding 7 days onto the previous date of the 14th, or in fact onto the date of work. So it's gone from the 14th today and added 7 days onto it. That's the end of that process. So there'll be a series of other videos that basically add complexity to this layer by layer. But this gives you an idea of the basic linkages in terms of creating this process. Once you get comfortable with these linkages, it really is incredibly flexible. So I hope you found that useful.